touched on the space, building on things I can't take the weight. Dry wood in the firelight, I picture your bed and your room and your life, and why can't this rise?
To anyone who has lost someone recently or is in grieving, I want to say that my heart really goes out to you, because you're probably dealing with that in a very private and girded way. In the olden days, people would wear black when they were in mourning, and everyone would know, okay, they're in a different state. But these days we just kind of turbo through. And it doesn't mean that the sadness and the pain isn't there. It just means that it's private, and that the process of grieving is very private now, I think. And I lost my mom a year ago last week, and I've really struggled to figure out like how to have the space and the time to acknowledge that loss. I'm too busy to have an existential meltdown, too many people depending on me, and there's also a discipline to grief. And I think also this is our turn as a generation. You know, as a generation, we're all losing our parents right now, and it's time to step up. And then I think also there's this quality to grief that almost privately you don't want to let go of, because it has such a beauty and a power to it, and it's ancient. It has this ancient quality and this echo, and it's sort of like this voices echoing in the caves thing of millions of years of humans living and dying and having to grapple with and accept this deeply mysterious pain of life and persevere and get back to living themselves. But there is also still the pain and the sadness, and it has to go somewhere. It has to change, and it has to change you, and you have to let it. Otherwise, it diminishes you and amputates you in some way. So for me, I've been teaching myself how to play the piano for the last year and a half, and I'm well past my old rock and roll days, but I did write this song, and it became kind of where I went with it. You know, this meticulous writing of a song about the movement from grief to joy. I recorded it this weekend with a band led by my husband and my kids and amazing musicians in Telluride, and just as another little echo in the cave, wanted to share it. And if anybody has any better ideas, I'd actually love to hear any tips from how other people are dealing with grieving as an adult. But this is what I did. I wrote this little song. Okay, and for any musicians out there, or artists, or people just interested in the process of art, I was absolutely obsessing over Beethoven towards the end of, like in December or something, when I was finishing the song, and I was super stuck with it. I actually didn't know where to take it, because it was just about despair and grief, and I didn't know how to resolve it. And I happened to get on a deep dive about Beethoven at the time, and if you haven't studied him, he is worth studying. And there's a reason that his symphonies and sonatas and things like that have stayed in the musical canon for this long. They're probably, like, he wrote, some of maybe the greatest pop song ever written was Beethoven's Ninth, the choral dun 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 dun. And the story behind that, I knew he was deaf, but I never really understood the nuances of it and what he was going through just as a person, and his songs, those symphonies, the fifth and the ninth being the greats, are really these movements from one state to another, or over the course of 4 to 5 orchestra movements, where they move, one of them moves from C minor to C major, the other one moves from D minor to D major. It's about the triumph of the human spirit. That's what his symphonies are about. And the fifth, that opening, da-da-da-da, is fate knocking at the door. He was writing that at the time that he was accepting his deafness and realizing that there was nothing that could be done medically. He was going to be deaf. And so that fifth symphony is about the movement from the despair at the loss of his hearing and his entire identity, and moving to triumph over that and still being able to write. And at that time, when he was sort of accepting his deafness, he was at this spa. It was sort of like his measure of last resort. Could he go to this health spa and somehow miraculously cure his hearing? And when he realized that that wasn't going to happen, he wrote this basically suicide letter to his brothers that he never sent. And basically what he was saying was, I would kill myself except that my art won't let me. And I cannot die until I bring forth everything that I have to bring forth within me, and it's such an amazing statement as an artist and as a human. And it was his triumph. So that was sort of what the fifth symphony was about. He then wrote his ninth, which was more about, brotherhood of man and the triumph of democracies and republics over, tyrannical governments. And it became, the anthem for the EU, and it's been the anthem for a lot of states, and good and bad over the years. But because it's a story about triumph of people and lives over authoritarian governments. And the movements, I really obsessed over the ninth. And the story is so cool because he was in hiding for 12 years because he was so humiliated by his deafness. It was his entire identity, and he couldn't admit to people that he could no longer hear. He was also in a box of himself because there was no conversation. He couldn't talk to people. He was completely isolated once his deafness really kicked in. And but he wrote, put a pencil in his mouth, heard the vibrations. He could write in his head, of course, and wrote his Ninth Symphony. And he came out of hiding to perform it in Vienna. It was the first time that choral had been pulled into a symphony. And it was such a powerful expression of the triumph of the human spirit. If there were a time in history, a place that I could have been, that would be on my short list, is to have been in that concert hall in Vienna when he first performed the Ninth. There was another conductor conducting it because he couldn't keep time with his deafness, so he was off in the corner doing this maniac conducting that nobody was paying attention to. And when it was over, he was still conducting because he was in such a mesmerized torpor with his own, being caught up in his own work in his head, that he didn't realize it was over, and he was still kind of in maniac mode conducting. And one of the singers turned him around so that he could experience the standing ovation and the reception of his work. And everybody was there. All the other composers were there. Anybody was there because they were so curious to see Beethoven after this 12-year self-imposed exile. And it changed musical history. It probably really was the greatest pop song ever written. Other people have said that, and I'm just agreeing with it. But so the movement, listening to that like 30 times, and I'm not in an expert way at all, but just listening to how it would move from despair to triumph, that's what I realized, okay, for this to resolve, it has to go from grief to joy. It has to go to its opposite, and that's a very I Ching thing as well, is that if you get a reading done with the I Ching, something in there to find your path forward, something in there has to, one of the qualities has to transform to its opposite, and that's your path forward, and that is the path forward. It's transformed to the opposite, right? So then that was really my unlock, and then I also just listened to how he built emotion into the music and how patient he was with a lot of his sonatas and silence, and slowness and legato and the way that it was played. And that sort of emboldened me to go sort of legato in the beginning, and then to change some of the rhythm throughout it, and to be just a little bit more unleashed with parts of it. I mean, that's what's so inspiring about Beethoven. He was just totally unleashed. I mean, that dude, once he lost his hearing, he just, there was this combustible, power to his own spirit. It's why he was able to write these symphonies that have stayed in the canon forever as the greatest representations of a human spirit in music. And so then I started to play around with it. It was really fun, just intellectually as a project, to just play with the rhythm and build in these little bouncing sonata moments. So just was inspired to try to learn from how he built emotion into the music and the conflict of, okay, it's gonna fall in the first movement, rise, fall in the middle movement, rise in the third movement, and just think about writing as a movement. But anyway, the point being just that if you haven't done a deep dive on Beethoven, it's super inspiring. And even though he was this cranky, misanthropic guy in his real life, once he couldn't engage with other people, it bottled him up into what he really wanted to be, his fantasy of himself, which was this great, open, magnanimous, people-loving person. And so he brought forth the fantasy of himself into these orchestras, these symphonies that still persist today as the greatest expressions of the triumph of humanity. And in one case, the personal triumph over despair, into joy. In another case, the triumph as a brotherhood, into overthrowing authoritarian regimes and asserting sort of people-led governance. And so yeah, I was just super inspired by Beethoven. He's really worth a deep dive, and that all sounds incredibly pretentious because this is just this dumb little song, but it was just wanted to share like my deep dive with him and everything that I learned about him that was so inspiring. Postscript, I also want to mention that the lyrics at the end of this song, the joy bright spark of God's was inspired or maybe directly pulled from his Ode to Joy choral section in his Ninth Symphony. And he had basically adapted Schiller's poem about brotherhood to this symphony, and that choral section that he does at the end is the lyrics are from Schiller's poem. So I translated those to some degree into the coda of this song. So I just wanted to acknowledge that little act of theft or inspiration or whatever it is. And the last thing I want to say, guys, is just more art, more music. And with all the roughness in the world these days, there's always roughness in the world, but it seems especially rough right now with all this, a lot of tough stuff in the news. But there's so much that we have in common as people, whether it's grief or the triumph of the human spirit and what we have within us, and that music and art play such an important role in the world. And one of my favorite poets is Seamus Heaney, was an Irish poet, and he would describe, there was a metaphor that was very central to him, that when he was growing up in rural Northern Ireland, there was a bucket in his house, there was a train track that ran behind his house. The bucket was always full of water, and when the train would run by, there would be ripples in the top of the bucket of the water, in the water. And that became a metaphor for him over the course of his life of the purpose of art, and that the purpose of art is to take what's in that water, the deepest well of our lives and our humanity, and bring up those universal feelings of being human as ripples in the water that are that connect out to what's happening externally. So it's creating this interface between inner feelings and external events, this ripple in the water on top of a bucket. And that I love that. I think that's very moving as a metaphor, and that is what art does. And so big shout out to all the people who've dedicated their lives to music or art, or put it in their lives in some way, because that's the best of us. That's the best side of us. And may there in 2026 and beyond be more art and more music and more community, more offline things that bring us together and remind us of everything that we have in common. So that's a lot of what shored up in me, this deep dive on Beethoven was more art, more music. Okay, that's it.